presentation mode.
All right, well, thank you. Thanks, Chip. So I noticed just perusing the names of the attendees here today that some of you have already heard one or other version of this presentation. So I gave a fairly high-level presentation to the actual council, and then another more detailed deep dive for the SFC. And this presentation really sort of brings both of those together, so it's sort of in between somewhere. But hopefully it gives you an understanding of some of the rationale behind why we conducted the study on the FES, and the steps forward to implement changes to the survey. So I'll just start out by pointing out that the FES is really one of several surveys that NOAA administers, and it's part of the suite of surveys that are encompassed by the Marine Recreational Information Program. There's a tendency to think of the program as being solely federal surveys, but it does contain a number of different regional surveys that are state administered or regionally administered through the commissions, for instance. So there's a number of different surveys in this suite, and not one of them is totally national in scope. The FES probably has the broadest distribution in terms of where it's conducted. Right now it's conducted from Maine through Mississippi, but also in Hawaii as well. So it represents really one of the larger surveys in terms of the area that it covers. All right, and as I pointed out, it's just one of several surveys, but it's a relatively simple survey. It involves a fairly simple questionnaire that's sent out to households, and it collects very basic information on fishing effort. And it does this at two different levels. It collects information on private boat fishing, and it collects information on shore fishing. And then it compares basically activity in the previous 2 months with activity over the course of the year. So that's the basic effort information that it collects. And we have details on how it's administered, how it's sampled, that provide a lot more detail. But generally speaking, it's administered in coastal states, and it gets information on resident trips that are made within those states. It doesn't get information on non-resident trips for anglers that are not residents of the state. We get that information from the Access Point Angler Intercept Survey. So there's pieces of information that go to generating an effort estimate that are not fully encompassed by the Fishing Effort Survey. We depend on the Access Point Angler Intercept Survey, which is our dockside survey, to get at additional pieces of information, such as the area fished, and then the out-of-state or off-frame effort. So when you put the catch information together with the effort, you end up getting an estimate of total catch. And this diagram we use an awful lot to kind of explain the process. It's a little bit more complex than this. We reference here weighted effort. So I bring this up because we depend on surveys for our data collection. And with any survey, there are respondents and there are non-respondents. There are certain demographics that like to respond probably more so than others. So we have to come up with a way of accounting for these differences. And that's why we come up with weights or sample weights for the draw. So we get a more accurate representation of the overall population. But anyway, you can see the red box here, the red circle sort of outlines the piece of information that the Fishing Effort Survey, or the FES, provides. And one of the things that we've paid a lot of attention to since we made the changes initially based on the National Academy's review of the old Marine Recreational Fisheries Statistics Survey was the development of a program that would allow us to monitor the the performance of our surveys. One of the things that was pretty clear when we made the transition from the Coastal Household Telephone Survey to the Fishing Effort Survey, when we went from basically a landline-based survey to a mail-based survey, was that when we started looking at demographics towards the end of that survey, we were seeing that we were not getting a good representation of the population. It basically was restricted or constrained by the demographics that were more aligned with the use of landlines. And as we know now, I mean, it's hard to find a house with any kind of a landline at this point. But the point of this little diagram here is to show that it's basically a continuous effort. We evaluate our current methods for performance to look at sources of error and bias, and then we test and review new methods that might address those sources of bias, and then we implement them. So, and once you implement them, you're basically back in the loop again of monitoring and keeping tabs on the performance of the survey. So some sources of error here, and I'm probably preaching to the choir, but there are different things that can affect the precision of an estimate. And we one of our biggest challenges is coming up with a precise enough estimate based on the survey information that we have. For some species, this is relatively straightforward and simple. But for others that are less frequently encountered, it can be a major challenge to come up with an estimate that's fairly reliable. So things that affect that are sample sizes. Small sample sizes obviously would be associated with rare event type species or pulse species that maybe the sample didn't hit. And then you have large variation in observations associated with certain species. So with pulse species, for instance, or just behavior of the fishery in general, you can end up with extreme observations that unduly affect the overall estimate. So factors that can affect the scaling of estimates, and I bring this up because in the report that we released back in May, we pointed to potentially overestimation in the Fishing Effort Survey. So this is really a scaling effect type of a scenario basically for the survey. So reporting error can be things that lead to that, and this could be misreporting of information. You can have your respondents maybe misremembering or forgetting certain events that you're asking for information about, or telescoping in information from a period that's not within the time frame that you're interested in. So there are different things that can happen. Non-response error is something that we pay particular attention to, because obviously when you have any kind of survey and you have basically a certain response rate associated with that survey, no matter how good that response rate is, you really don't know if that population that's responding is similar to the one that isn't responding. And if so, would the estimate be different? So there are different things that we do to try and keep tabs on that, such as demographic profiling of our samples, as well as our respondent pool. So we try to match what we initially set out as our sample versus what we get back from the public in terms of their demographic characterization. So it could be the age, structure, or it could be the geography of the response, things like that. And then there are a couple of other items here. Non-response error I mentioned, but coverage error is another thing that can have a big impact. So every survey that I'm aware of uses a list of some sort to use as a sample frame. So that's what we use to sample the population of interest. And in some cases, there are frames that are more efficient than others. So for instance, if we had a list of licensed fishermen or fishermen with a certain endorsement, and we sampled that. That's an example of a fairly tightly defined population, and would have a fairly strict sample frame. But with the fishing effort survey, we have a variety of different sources of information. We use basically two sources. We use the delivery sequence file by the US Postal Service, and that basically gives us a list of all eligible households, active households, that we can send the mail out to. And that's probably the most accurate list there is. There are still some issues with it. We do quite a bit of cleaning of that information to make sure that it represents active households. And then we use license information, and we try to match that license information to that US postal information, so that we can more efficiently sample angling households. The issue here is that the US postal address database is very large and not very efficient in terms of the information you get back from that. And the other issue is that for license information, there are lots of exemptions depending on the state that the license represents. And there are certainly unlicensed anglers that are not represented. So basically, these are some of the things we have to deal with and the things we try to monitor in our research program. So evaluation of measurement error, and this was a major concern for us because we felt like this could be a source of error for the survey. And it has been shown in the literature that even the way survey instruments are, we'll say, responded to can change over time. You get changes in the demographics that are interested in responding to the survey. You may have some regulatory, we'll say, events that occur that might affect the respondent pool. Different things like that can really affect who responds to surveys and how they respond. So that's something that we want to keep an eye on or keep tabs on. So the report that came out in May, and it garnered quite a bit of attention, and largely the attention was focused on just one part of that report, which had to do with the question order effects. And this was a large component of the report. But essentially, when we reversed the order of just two questions on the survey, we found that the estimates were reduced considerably, on average about 30 to 40%, but that varied depending on fishing mode. So you could get up to 50% reduction in shore effort, depending on the state that you looked at, and then also 20 to 30% with private boat effort. I will say that these were general trends. We did see some variation among the states that were involved in the study, and so there's also an issue that we used a small sample size. So it was something that we probably needed to evaluate a little bit further. So essentially, the report described three different things. It talks a little bit about questionnaire development for the FES, how it came about, the type of testing that went into designing the current version that's in the field. And then there were two other studies that were highlighted. One evaluated 1 month waves. The current survey works on a 2-month wave. So we sample every 2 months the activity of the previous 2 months. So for instance, at the end of January, February, in March, we'll send out a survey that asks about the fishing effort of those 2 months. And that continues throughout the year. And then the second study, as I mentioned already, was the question order effect study. So I won't get into the details of the t-tests and so on, p-values. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the types of thing we included in the testing. So hopefully you can see these two side-by-side questionnaires here. We tested several questionnaire versions during the development of the initial FES. And we had single 2-month period unbounded versus multiple discrete periods that were bounded. And by bounded, what I mean is that there were other reference periods included. So for instance, you might ask about, we'll say, March and April as one question, but then you could ask about January and February, or in the case of the test that's shown here on the far right, there are 3 reference periods to go along with the reference period that you're interested in. So, and they vary in length. So that gives us a chance to evaluate side by side the impacts of including additional time periods in there to bound the answer versus where you just ask about a single 2-month period and leave it. There is plenty of literature out there that points to when you provide more than one reference period, and one is basically included in the other. So if it's a subset of the other, in the case of the current survey, we use the previous 2 months, and then we ask about the previous year, including those 2 months. And it tends to allow the respondent to calibrate their answer. So they will look at their year activity and compare it with their 2-month activity. And that gives them a sense of, that seems right or not. So anyway, and then a third part of this was conducting what we call cognitive interviews. And those are basically panels of anglers that we bring in to fill out the survey and answer the survey. And then we go back with each of those anglers and go through question by question their reasoning or the rationale behind the answers that they gave for all of the questions. And one thing I'll point out is in the initial development, there was a sense of frustration from some anglers that they had fishing trips to report, but the reference periods didn't cover them. And they really wanted to report them, but they felt like, this is valuable information and we're not considering it because it's not in those reference periods. So that was a source of frustration. I want you to keep that in mind as we go through the seminar. So just to give you an idea, all of these pilot studies were limited in scope. We didn't do every single state. We usually limited to 4 states, we'll say. But in the case of the most recent FES test that we looked at question order, we did use all states, but we used a reduced sample size. So anytime you do a pilot study, you're sort of faced with decisions relative to how many states do you want to include, or how much sample size do you want to include in a state to get a good evaluation of the change that you're looking at. So in the questionnaire development, bounded design was implemented over several successive waves, and that allows us to compare data on one reference period collected at one wave with the next wave. So you have multiple opportunities to compare information that's reported. And it provides independent estimates of the fixed reference period. So all of these studies, all of these questionnaires were administered to different samples within the same population. So nobody got the same survey twice. And as I mentioned, the surveys varied in recall length and question order. And the collective effect of recall length and question order and the estimates really were still of question, because you have 2 effects that are essentially combined in one survey. So in developing the questionnaire, some key points. What we found is that bounding, including another reference period against the one that you're interested in, resulted in lower estimates than if you just did the reference period by itself. So if I just ask about fishing trips in June and July and did not ask about the previous year, including those months, I tended to get a larger estimate when I didn't include the year question in there. Estimates were higher when the length of recall period was shorter and when the reference period was presented first in the sequence. So when you ask about the reference period first and not we'll say the year, you tended to get higher estimates than if you reverse those. However, what we found in the initial development of the survey is that we couldn't really disentangle effects from omission of trips and telescoping of error, or telescoping trips in from different reference periods. So that still remained a question for us, and we still have some work to do as far as addressing that. So cognitive interviews suggested that anglers want to be identified as such and are eager to report their fishing activity. So, and they do feel some sense of frustration when they can't report their fishing activity. So that's another reason for including a larger reference period. It sort of satisfies that desire to report as well. And then the questionnaire testing and angler feedback resulted in the current FES questionnaire, which includes a 2-month recall period followed by a 12-month bounding period. So that's the design that's currently in the field. And we went with that design not so much because, well, let me see if I can phrase this the right way. So we went with that design based on the premise that it's a paper survey. The questions are right next to each other. It shouldn't really matter whether you ask the 2-month question first or the 12-month question. They have a chance to compare them. And so their answer, you would think, or we assumed, would reflect that. So on to the 1-month questionnaire. So again, we tested different treatments, we'll say. And in this case here, you see three different treatments side by side for the 1-month questionnaire testing. And the first one there is the FES, the gray. That's the FES current design. So basically, we're asking about, let's see, is it shore fishing trips for the previous wave and then in the previous year. And then we go to private boat after that and ask the same questions again. And if you go to treatment 1, you'll see that we ask about the months separately, but we include 2 different months and a reference period. And then in the second treatment, we only ask about 1 month, and we still include that reference period, the 12-month reference period. But the treatment 1 allows us to get information on 2 separate months that we can basically draw on or compare with information the following month. So we'll be getting a comparison of, we'll say in this case here, we'll be looking at July again in August, or we'll be looking at July again with the August sample. So we'll have a 2-month recall period for July trips and a 1-month recall period. So hopefully that's not too confusing. Anyway, this slide here is just showing you those differences and where, how the survey questionnaire is different. And again, this is just a diagram to show you that for each of the months that we're interested in this case here, July, August, and so on through December, we get 2 opportunities to collect information on each month. And that has that also has value in building sample and precision as we implement changes to the survey. So essentially, the study was implemented over several successive months, like we did in the past. It provided independent estimates for a fixed month, and reference periods were presented in chronological order. So in other words, we ask about the month that's furthest away first, and then the month that's closer second. And it allowed us to evaluate recall length and question order in the estimates. So key points here or key findings. Basically, bounding again reduces the estimates and is likely to be more effective at reducing telescoping error when the bounding question precedes the reference period. Let me see. No, hang on, I'm going backwards here. I think, no, I'm not. Yeah, okay. So, and then secondly, the 2-month FES reference period may mitigate some of the telescoping error. So if you use a longer period than a 1 month, there's a tendency to, there's less of a tendency to draw trips that might have been made the month before into the current reference period. So the longer that period gets, the less likely that is to happen. Estimates were higher when the recall period was longer and when the reference period was presented first in the question order. So when we asked about the most recent period first, we tended to get larger estimates, and that's what the current FES design is. It asks about your previous 2 months first and then the 12 months. When you reverse that, you get the opposite effect. You get lower estimates overall. So it suggests that the question order has a greater effect than recall length. Telescoping error is likely to be the predominant source of measurement error in the FES rather than omission error. And that's consistent with what we found with the cognitive testing as well, because as I said, anglers want to report about their fishing trips. They think they're important, so they want that information out there. So there is a tendency to err on the side of caution when it comes to including trips. Especially if it straddles one wave or another, anglers will tend to, well, some anglers will tend to include those. Question order effects. So the treatments here, there are 4 different treatments, and I won't get into the details here, but basically, as I mentioned with the FES, we ask about shore fishing trips first, and then private boat trips. And we ask about the 2-month period first, and then we ask about the 12-month period. So essentially, these 4 different panels here compare the different combination, reversing the order of mode and reversing the order of the questions on the 12-month versus 2-month questions. And key points of the results of that study. Basically, the order of the 2-month, 12-month question has a stronger effect than mode order. So we didn't see much in the way of differences when we just switched private boat mode with shore and asked about private boat trips first, keeping the month questions the same. We did see an effect when we changed the question order, and that resulted in lower estimates. And then the take home here is that asking about the 12-month question before the 2-month question appears to reduce the telescoping error, resulting in more accurate estimates than the current FES design. And people have asked, how do we know they're more accurate? Well, there are some metrics that we use in evaluating the survey responses. One is the error rate, and the error rate is lower now when you ask the 12-month question first versus the 2-month question. And some of in talking to the consultants, the statistical consultants that conducted the cognitive interviews, they suspect that when you ask the 12-month question first, regardless if it's a paper form and it's on the form, they're going to answer the questions in the order that they're given generally. But having the 12-month question having it first may satisfy that desire to want to report trips. And so, if that trip is included in the 12-month period and it wasn't supposed to be in the 2-month period, the angler is more aware of that and tends to report more accurately for the 2-month period. I know it's a lot of things I've kind of thrown at you, but overall, based on those studies, these are the key findings. Telescoping error is likely to be the predominant form of measurement error. So that's pulling in trips from outside the reference period. Bounding is likely to reduce telescoping error. And so if you include a reference period along with the one you're interested in, it will reduce the estimates. But if you put that bounding period before you ask about the reference period, then you end up with lower estimates. So we think that based on that survey, that implementing a more effective questionnaire will likely result in lower estimates. I like to hedge that though with the fact that this was a limited study. In the case of the 1 month wave study, it was conducted in 4 states over a 6-month period and had reduced sample sizes. And in the case of the question order study, it was conducted in all of the states for which the FES is currently conducted, but was also had reduced sample sizes and reduced time period. Just moving along here. So the follow-up study that we have planned for next year pulls the information from the 1 month wave study and the question order study together, and we'll evaluate those combined into a single survey comparison. And the reason for doing it this way is that it simplifies things in terms of our calibration model. We use a model, it's called a Fay-Harriott model, and it's a small area estimation technique. So there are different effects that are accounted for in that model, one being mode effects. And we can combine the changes to the FES into mode effects, I think, and model in such a way that it doesn't overly tax the model in terms of its performance, but also overly complicate the model and produces a more efficient calibration process and a simpler calibration process. So that's the goal, is to do this study throughout 2024. We'll use comparable sample sizes for the current FES with the comparison study that will have the new questionnaire and 1 month waves. The study is informed by the previous 2 results and also the development process that we had for the FES. One thing is that I should mention is the last bullet on the slide, is that monthly sampling, this was something that was identified as a priority for our partners along the Atlantic and Gulf Coast, for that matter, because it would reduce the time, or the time between the availability of estimates for catch, and also it would reduce the frequency of their availability as well. And there are some other benefits, such as improved precision at the annual level and maybe at the 2 month and month wave level as well. So there are some effects here that were asked for by our constituents, our state partners in particular, and those were identified in their Atlantic Coastal Cooperative Statistics Program Recreational Implementation Plan. So that's a plan where they identify their top priorities, and this is among the top priorities in their plan. There was also a priority in the Gulf and on the West Coast, so improving sample sizes, improving the resolution of the estimates that we get. And so the next steps, a follow-up study, it's, as I mentioned, the FES calibration will be updated for the revised design. And we've actually started working on that already. Calibration model, basically we're using the information from the previous pilot studies to sort of train the model, or to look for some, perhaps some challenges that might exist when we start plugging in the data from 2024. But the plan is to evaluate the performance of the model using the pilot study information, doing some simulations, and then as soon as data become available for 2024, we will start plugging that in. And that should be right after the first month of data collection. So there'll basically be 12 different incidences where we're adding data to the model throughout the year. So that should give us, plenty of time during 2024 and early 2025 to evaluate the model. And the goal would be then to complete the model, produce an updated time series for peer review sometime in mid-2025. And I've been told at some of the other meetings that that seems overly optimistic, but I think it's realistic in terms of if we can conduct the study and the data comes in on time, we should be able to get the calibration model changes in place in time for about mid-year, and that will give us the rest of the year to conduct the peer review and position ourselves potentially for 2026 implementation of the survey. There are a few other wildcards in there as well. So obviously there's a transition planning process, and our partners are involved with that. So we'll have to be able to make the case to our state partners that, you know, this expedited time frame is appropriate, given that we did 3 years of benchmarking for the previous calibration process. And I think we can make the case basically because we're using the same model that has been peer reviewed. And essentially the changes that we're making are fairly minor in terms of the overall development and design of the model. And again, I noticed a few faces in the audience that are probably cringing when they see this picture, but essentially calibration is a very important process. We know that surveys give us different estimates, and all surveys come with a certain amount of error. So when you change modes or change the way you collect data, there isn't really there shouldn't be an assumption that the time frame or the time series will remain intact. You have to be able to account for survey design changes when you compare data from one survey to another. So the calibration model allows us sort of a reasonable way to do that. It allows us to translate the previous method into the current method, and vice versa to some extent. There are some limitations in terms of how far you can project to the future to come up with to continue the old time series versus how reliable the model gets as you go further back in time. So anyway, I just put that in there just to illustrate the point. And you can see here when we move from on the left-hand side, when we move from the CHTS to the FES, there was a huge jump in the estimates, and that was largely reflected two things. One is a change in mode, the way we collected data, the type of survey that we used, and then also a change in the population that was responding to the previous survey versus the one that we were targeting in the new survey. So that as time went by, the estimates for the previous survey were less reflective of the fishing population, and so we had to account for that in the model as well. And I think that's about it, except that I have one slide here on assessment and management implications. And we've been getting a lot of questions from different bodies regarding guidance from NOAA as far as how to proceed. And I think largely these questions are being answered by the SSCs in particular. And one thing I will point out is that we reported the results of a pilot study. It's not currently implemented. There is no way to translate, effectively the information from that pilot study to the old method or vice versa. So the survey that's in place in the field remains the best and sometimes the only available science for tracking relative year-to-year trends in fishing effort. And we do expect, though, that this trend is probably not going to change too much. It's more of a scaling effect than anything else. We don't have issues like we had with the previous transition, where we were trying to account for things like increased cell phone use. That's already in the model, so that's accounted for. So it's a simpler process this time around, but I don't want to oversimplify it and I don't want to oversell the results of the pilot studies. And then stock status, from what we've seen, and it's been very limited, is relatively consistent when trend information doesn't change, where there is just a scaling effect to account for that. I mean, obviously, productivity, things like that are affected. And then the focus really is on continued conversations with partners and on these programmatic improvements. We plan to, as we get information available from the calibration evaluations that we're doing, and then also the status of the survey once we implement it in the field in 2024, we plan to keep the the councils in particular updated on that progress so that they're better prepared for possible delays if they do occur, although at this point we're not anticipating them. I think that's about it really. The other thing I'll point out in the last part here is that there is an opportunity to look at different management options that may not have been considered in the past when it comes to survey information. We know that surveys can give you different answers for the same question. We know that there's a scaling effect here. So there may be some opportunities here to look at the way, for instance, allocations being handled, things like that. I'm on the science end of things, so I'm not going to, present this as the agency's perspective or anything, but just some points to consider. And I think that's it. I have a few links here to different reports and data collection and estimation documentation that we have in case people are interested. And then also a link to the different pilot studies that we've conducted over the years. And as I said, these are just two of several of many that we've done. And there are a number still in the planning as well as we go forward. So I think, Chip, that's all I have. So if folks have any questions.
Thank you, Richard. I just posted all those links into the webinar chat. If anybody wants to see them, you can pull those out and look at those at your opportunity when you have a chance. Let me take back presentation mode from you. Okay, just a reminder on how to work the webinar. Once again, you can enter questions into the question box, and I see we have one that's in there right now. You can also raise your hand by clicking on the icon that is hand drawn. And then once you've raised your hand, we'll unmute you. You'll hear that from the webinar that you've been unmuted. Then click on the microphone button to make sure it turns green. That'll signify that you've been unmuted to speak. So with that, is there anyone that would like to raise their hand? Okay, I'll read Thomas Newman's questions. If you used weighted information to quiet noise and other responses due to the survey not possibly representing everyone equally, why can you not weight the FES response instead of possibly changing the FES survey? Or are you already weighting the FES responses and the issue possibly cannot be remedied without changes?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it does bring up the question of how we handle potential improvements to surveys. We know the process itself is extremely disruptive to management, and there's a tendency, at least on my end, to do the pilot studies, monitor the survey, see how it performs, and then bundle those changes together for a rollout that encompasses a number of changes. The question you asked is about the current weighting methods. We use basically a weighting procedure that compares our current sample with with the respondents. So we look at we try to characterize it in terms of demographics. And that weighting process is fairly straightforward. It could be a little bit more sophisticated in my opinion. There are other sources of information that we could use, I think, that could be used to weight the different demographics that respond to the survey a bit better. And that's one of the challenges as we go forward. There's an expectation that when management produces some information, that we latch onto that and correct weights for the different samples. I think the issue for us here is a measurement error question, and we don't know how that's going to track over time. And making changes to the survey, the way most other surveys would handle this, they would make the change, and there'd be an asterisk beside it saying don't compare the data collected previously because we're not using the same surveys. So we tried to handle that using a calibration process instead. So it's a mixture of methods when it comes to aligning the response, we'll say the response pool with the population. And I think that's something that we believe changes over time. And we've seen some studies following COVID that indicate, that right now there's, for several surveys, how people respond to surveys and the demographic that actually responds is changing. And so there's that element that we try to handle. It's very hard to wait for all of those appropriately. And there's always a question about when you complicate the weighting process to a point where your initial sample weights look nothing like your final sample weights, it gets called into question. So our approach has been, make the changes to the survey so that it's a little bit more stable in terms of accounting for that difference, rather than using weights that might change over time. You still have to track them. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but that's the approach that we tried to take.
Thomas said, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It was a great question.
Any other questions? If not, I will throw a question in there for myself. I was wondering if you think there might be a difference between the way somebody responds to how you previously conducted the survey through the phone compared to a paper-based survey. I know there was some cognitive tests that you were doing, and I'm wondering if there's a difference on how people respond either through a phone survey or a paper-based survey.
Yeah, there are, and a lot of it has to do with the way the survey is administered. So for instance, questions tend to follow a sequence, and there are decision points in the sequence in telephone surveys and web surveys too, for that matter, that is very different than the way a survey is responded to by, if it's a mail survey. Mail survey, you just sit down with the thing and you can actually look at all of the questions before you even answer the first one. And that's very different from mail and, or not mail, but phone and web-based surveys in particular. And there's some pretty good research out there right now that shows that there are some real problems with mixed mode surveys that contain a number of different modes within the same survey to get at pieces of information. They're not always comparable. We did do a pilot study a number of years back where we did a push to web design versus the mail survey design, and the estimates were not that too different. There was a drop in the response rate that kind of bothered us a little bit. But we think that we're getting to a point now where web surveys are more accepted, and there's, it may be an option for us. So if you are to mix modes, mail and web might be a viable option for improving the precision of a survey, or at least giving you a way to compare what you get with one with the other. So we see that as part of maybe, you know, our future anyway.
All right, Judd, I see you have your hand raised.
Hi, Richard. Judd Curtis, South Atlantic Council staff. Thanks for the presentation and for presenting to the Scientific and Statistical Committee last month as well. And question I had kind of stems from a little bit from their discussion. And so they, you identified some of the biases in the FES survey. And then with the new pilot studies, those will have their inherent biases as well. And so really kind of the goal is to try to figure out which survey more closely or most closely mirrors the truth of what's the true estimate of what's going on out there, right? And so we don't know exactly what that is at this point. There is, you hinted at there was some indication that you identified certain errors in that survey. But I guess my question is then, what are some of the other ongoing validations, or you mentioned the calibration surveys, and then of course the full study that's happening in 2024. But what are some of the other gaps in the data that we can either collect better data on, or to improve estimates, or get at what the true estimate might actually be?
I think there are a number of different options, but none of them really get us away from doing surveys. Oftentimes you hear, well, we just need to have every angler report. And that's many millions of anglers. And it also means if you're doing a census, you report every trip. And that can be, a huge response burden on, the fishing community. And as well as that, there's, the data collection challenge and the data management challenge for something like that. That said, though, I think that there's a number of initiatives out there right now that look at ways to inform the data that we already collect. And we're doing sort of we have a joint working group with the Southeast Center where we're looking at different options for alternative estimation that will improve the precision of estimates. But we realized that, once you start getting away from the design-based estimates, then you have other challenges that have to be addressed. But there are some really, I think, promising methods, small area estimation methods in particular, that use other data to inform the weights. And that was the first question I got today related to that. And gives me a chance to kind of mention it again. But we're quite a ways off from getting those data into a format that we can, that's standard and that we can use to inform the weights. So for instance, we could have regulatory information that might better inform the behavior of the sample over a wave. It might be that, it points to a period where the fishery was shut down, or where a targeting switch from one species to another, and would give us a better understanding of why the data are behaving the way they are. It's not always small sample size. It's sometimes the distribution of the sample within the wave that can impact what we see. So I think it's a complicated question. We don't know the truth, and the only way of knowing that really is to have something that can reliably estimate, or I shouldn't say estimate, count the numbers of anglers and numbers of trips that they take. That aside, I think there's some promise with satellite technology. There's also some states that are interested in using video monitoring. So they monitor activity at egress points for fishing in open waters, those kinds of things, and get a sense of how many trips are being made from different locations. And that, coupled with using more panel surveys where you get information to fill in the gaps, basically, that doesn't involve a huge large-scale survey, but involves perhaps a smaller scale survey that's more targeted to different areas where the fishing activity might be occurring. So I think there's a mixture of techniques that are are going to have to be looked at in the future. We can't continue really to rely on large-scale surveys for information that's sufficiently precise for ACL management, but also gives you reliable trend information. Those two things are difficult to do with one survey. So I don't know, Judd, if that answers your question or muddies the water a bit, but I think there are a number of things that need to be looked at, and I would say that they're not cheap. The satellite counting of vessels, and there's some assumptions that go along with that you're actually, the vessels you're counting are actually recreational fishing vessels versus something else. But it has been used effectively for right whale counts and things like that. So there's some promise there as well. And if it gets us in the ballpark, it can identify or help us identify the sources of error that are contributing to the estimates that we get from our design-based surveys.
Yeah, Richard, no, thanks. That answers it. It's a muddy question and a muddy process. I just want to get your input on where else we can go from here. So thanks.
All right, the next question comes from online. Most of the people willing to spend 15 to 20 minutes to take a survey like MRIP after a fishing trip aren't likely to be a representative sample. How do you address that type of bias in the survey?
Well, the person that it takes 15 minutes to interview is not your average angler to begin with. Most of the interviews that our samplers conduct, from what I've, from the information that I have when I was at the state level, is 1 to 3 minutes. It can be a fairly quick process. There's electronic data collection now in place where we use tablets to collect the data, and that has made it a little bit more efficient in terms of error checking and so on. So that may have extended the length of the survey, but in general, they're fairly short. But a bigger challenge here in reference to your question is that we're sampling at public access sites. So the assumption is that the information that we capture at those public access sites reflects the overall population. And we know, for instance, in the South Atlantic, that there is a huge amount of private access fishing. So we don't get access to those trips. We are looking at different pilot studies that will give us a chance to compare the two. But again, there is quite likely a bias between private access versus public access. I think what we do to address your concern about a representative sample of anglers is we try to interview as many as we can, get as much information from them as we can. And for those we miss, those are counted, so it's used in the eventual weights that are assigned. So that's not perfect, but I think it's a reasonable approach when it comes to getting the most you can out of the survey. There are some other quality control measures that we look at as well, in terms of sizes of fish reported, numbers of fish reported at sites and locations, and make comparisons with those. So anyway, hopefully that addresses some of your question, but bias is inherent in every survey. So I get the point that we should be concerned with bias in all of our surveys.
Thank you for the response. Any other questions? And Ty, if that answered your question enough, please let us know.
Yeah, and Chip, anybody can always email me. It's richard.cody@noaa.gov if they have follow-ups they want to find out more information on.
Okay, Thomas has his hand raised.
Yeah, thank you for answering my earlier question. With the last question that you answered, I know like in my home state of North Carolina, we're only sampling a tiny fraction of a percent of the anglers on the APIS survey. What kind of percentage sample size do you need to get better estimates on the APIS survey and more specific on the FES survey? I know y'all always say you want more, but if we get to a certain threshold, 10%, 30%, how would that help us get better data? Thank you.
Well, yeah, we use a number of different methods to try and achieve a certain level of precision. So we try to get what we call 20% variance estimates at the state level, and that's for the FES. We have a different approach for the APIS, two different surveys. So you can increase sample size with one, and that gets you so far, and then you can increase it with the other. It gets you a little bit further. But the challenge is here is really that there are an enormous amount of anglers out there, and the concern is not about achieving a certain percentage of those anglers. We like you said, we achieve a very small fraction of probably a few percent at best in some states, and even less in others, of the trips that are made. So as I said, the main thing is to try and achieve a certain level of precision given the sample sizes that you can afford, basically. There are methods that we use. One's called the Neiman method, and that optimizes your sample based on response rates and a number of different other factors that come into play. So some states require us to do a much bigger sample size to achieve that level of precision. And other states like Florida, for instance, where there are many anglers and have lots of trips to report, those require a lot less sample. So it sort of is counterintuitive in some respects, because we need less sample in Florida than we do in Mississippi, for instance, or Georgia. And so that doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you present that to an angler. But from the perspective of trying to get the estimate, to a certain level of precision, that's how it operates. The other thing I'll point out too is that for some species, we can add sample forever, and we will never get to that 20% PSE level. And the various approaches that have been taken are to do more specialized surveys that narrow down that population, so that you're sampling only those individuals. But that becomes impractical at a point too, because you do this for every single species and have a special targeted survey by species, or do you do it by a suite of species, and who decides what you sample and what you don't? And we found also that over time, sometimes the composition of catch, we'll say, associated with a certain target species can change over time. So you might be kind of creeping away from the true answer also over time as well. So it's a complicated question. I mean, you can go online and you can find power analysis and things like that will give you a number, but it doesn't take into consideration things like the design of the survey, and other effects that might be at play. They're usually fairly simple. It's about how much sample do I need to look at the difference between two populations for one parameter. So we're looking at something that's a little bit more complex, and it is a problem for us because things are not getting any cheaper. The field portion of our survey has become a lot more expensive over time, and the same is true of the mail survey. So that there are some things I think that we can do on our end to try and improve the efficiency of our sampling, and also the efficiency of the performance of the sample. So we do things like add strata to our survey designs, and that kind of narrows down the population in some cases. So for offshore fishing, we're able to get a better estimate than we have in the past. And there are other tweaks that we can do, but all of those don't address the overall need for additional sample. hopefully that sort of addresses your question. I mean, it is a good point.
We had a question entered into the question box. In your experience, do states that have a fee-based saltwater fishing license provide you a better or more complete data set of anglers and their demographics than states that do not?
They allow us a better chance with our survey anyway to match households with fishing with licenses. So when we can do that, the more we can do that, the more efficient our sample gets. We can target those fishing households, and we weight them based on that targeting, so we don't over-represent them. But at the same time, it does have precision effects for us, so it improves the precision of your estimate when you can do that. For state surveys that use those fee-based licenses or license lists as frames, obviously it works well. It's a specialized type of a survey situation. So that's their target population. There may be some coverage concerns, but it's probably less so than we would have with our survey, because we're dealing with just a wider variety of species and much more diverse population that we're trying to capture information for. So I think there's quite a bit of value to having specialized surveys, but they come at a cost in terms of just the response burden on the angler, and also just the data management side as well, where you have several different sources of data. And then the question is, can you compare those sources in a way that is meaningful? Just because you have a more accurate survey doesn't mean it's comparable with what you already have in place.
Thank you. Any other questions? I feel like Richard's been on the hot seat quite a bit.
I'm used to it. No, I mean, I appreciate the opportunity to kind of, present what we do. I think, we've struggled with getting our message out of what we do and what we try to do. So any opportunity that is provided, and this is a great forum for that, where we can at least, give you a sense of the logistics of running a survey and data collection, as well as the estimation part of it.
Yeah, and we certainly appreciate you coming. And if anybody has any additional questions, I did enter Richard's email address into the chat box. So if you click on that, you can find it. I saw Samantha had her hand up for a second and then it went back down. Samantha, did you have a question? But we'll also have this recorded, so if you want to send this along to anyone else, or you want to go back and look at what was presented today, there'll be a video on the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council webpage. Just go into meetings and then seminar series, and we have links to all our previous presentations. So seeing no other hands are raised and no other questions, we really thank you today, Dr. Cody. It was a very informative presentation, and I got a lot out of it. I hope everyone else did. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Everybody have a good day.